The bells rang for a wedding that never began. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Your messages make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's uncover the truth. At 10:30 on a Saturday morning, the villagers of Little Ambrose, an eminently respectable place with geraniums in almost every window and a cricket pitch revered like a shrine, had arranged themselves into that particular expectancy which attends a wedding that everybody approves. The churchyard yews, clipped with soldierly exactitude, cast cool shadows over the gravel path, and inside St. Jude's, the air smelt pleasantly of beeswax and lilies. Miss Jane Marple, in a hat soft enough not to invite attention, and gloves darned just invisibly enough to satisfy herself, took a modest pew near the back and folded her hands over her reticule. She liked weddings. People, under ceremonial strain, revealed themselves as surely as if they had chosen to walk about with their pocket diaries open. The bride was Miss Celia Harbord, fair, practical, and prettily anxious, as brides often are. The groom, Mr. Guy Ellerton, returned from some business in the colonies. Cameroon? No. Ceylon. Tea, Miss Marple remembered. Newly settled at the White House by the mill stream and firm in his determination to modernise it. The Harbords were old Little Ambrose stock, the Ellertons newer. There had been murmurings, naturally. Mrs. Parry from the post office had sniffed over the difference between tea money and land money. Mr. Leake, the verger, had found the groom's boutonniere, white carnation rather than a rose, strangely foreign. But the village had decided in the end to be proud of its occasion, and the cake in the church hall had 3 tiers and a little icing dovecote besides. At 10:40, the bridesmaids, 2 in pale blue and 1, the cousin from Exeter, in a shade that suggested an unfortunate quarrel with the laundress, rustled up the nave. The organist essayed Largo as a soothing exercise. The vicar checked his watch with pious resignation. There is a particular silence which falls at the point when a wedding ought to begin and does not. It is composed of optimism firmly gripped by doubt. Miss Marple heard it, and from force of habit, catalogued it. Outside, across the square, the village green had dressed itself in bunting that inclined to droop in the heat. A child, sticky with barley sugar, let his balloon go and set up a wail. Mrs. Withers, who ran the bakery, shushed him with a paste bun and an opinion about modern mothers. A little knot of boys had collected by the lich gate, betting halfpennies on whether the bride would cry and whether the groom's best man, Mr. Hugh Colling, sleek and capable, would go red at the ears when required to find the ring. "It is 10 minutes past," said Mrs. Parry, in a voice trained by years of capitals stamped onto envelopes. "You'd think with all that money they'd afford a clock that keeps time." "Traffic," murmured Mrs. Withers, though Little Ambrose had difficulty producing anything more intimidating than the milk cart and the occasional motor coach of tourists who insisted upon photographing the duck pond. "Or nerves." Miss Marple observed the mother of the bride, Mrs. Harbord, exchange a look with the housekeeper, a stiff-faced woman with narrow eyes and hands that twisted perpetually in a clean cloth. The mother's complexion had the high glazed look achieved by women who know they must not cry. The housekeeper's had no expression at all, which in Miss Marple's experience often denotes more feeling than can be permitted to show. Guy Ellerton, alone at the chancel step, maintained an easy carriage that might have passed for calm, were it not for the smallest pulse at the hollow of his throat. At 10:50, the organist began to falter. The best man went out, returned, and went out again. A ripple of whispering moved like wind through wheat. "She was seen at the Mill Lane half an hour ago," breathed the cousin from Exeter to the bridesmaid in pale blue, forgetting to whisper. "The veil was pinned wrong and she sent Ruby back for a comb." "Ruby," said Mrs. Parry, who could no more refuse a morsel of gossip than a robin can refuse a crumb. "The parlour maid," said the bridesmaid. "She's frightfully dependable. Oh." For the church door had opened upon a figure not vested in white, but in rain-dulled tweed, though no rain had fallen. It was Sergeant Cotter from the constable's house, very red, very damp from exertion, and very uncomfortable in the eyes of 100 people who did not expect him here. "Vicar," he said quietly, his gaze careful not to meet the groom's. "A word." The word lengthened into a pause, that lengthened into a murmur, that lengthened into a hum. The vicar inclined his head, listened, and became, as vicars sometimes do in unfortunate circumstances, suddenly older. He shut his prayer book, cleared his throat, and said something which the congregation could not hear, and therefore supplied for themselves in 100 variations. Miss Marple had a view of the vicar's hand tightening upon the lectern. She also had a view, she always arranged to have one, of the aisle and the porch beyond, where a slender ribbon had caught in the hinge and fluttered like a small trapped bird. White satin, soiled at the edge. It smelt faintly of something that was not lilies, not lavender either, something sharper, like a dressing room crowded with too many scents. At last the vicar spoke audibly. "There is some delay," he said, "if you will wait patiently." But patience is not the virtue of crowds. The hum thickened. People stood, sat, began to drift like spilt sugar. Mrs. Harbord rose with a small, decisive sound. "I shall go to Celia," she said, though nobody had suggested she should not. The housekeeper seized the cloth with both hands as if to wring it into speech. The best man, Mr. Colling, put a supportive hand to the groom's arm. Guy Ellerton shook it off, not unkindly, and walked down the aisle with a look that suggested he would have preferred a battlefield, any battlefield, to this. Miss Marple did not move fast, because moving fast is not the habit of old ladies who are never in the way and always where they are needed. But she did move, a little sideways, a little back, until she found herself at the porch. The ribbon tugged with the door and released. She caught it in her gloved fingers. The satin was streaked with what might have been dust, except that dust does not smear like that. Powder then. Face powder. The sharp scent came from the ribbon itself, as if it had been pressed against a cheek newly made up. There was also the faintest trace, a narrow width where the sheen had flattened, of having been wedged under something heavy for a time. "Pretty, isn't it?" said a voice by her elbow. It was Mr. Leake the verger, his small eyes more inquisitive than his posture allowed. "From the bride's bouquet, likely. It came off when the sergeant pushed through." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. She let the ribbon fall. It clung an instant to her glove, as satin will if it carries the ghost of grease. Outside, the square had begun to fill with speculation, like seeds blown onto good soil. Ruby the parlour-maid, cheeks blotched pink with hot tears, had arrived with her apron untidily on and her cap askew. "She told me to fetch the tortoiseshell comb," Ruby kept saying, "the one that belonged to Miss Celia's grandmother. She said she'd meet me by the yews if she didn't want to be seen." Ruby's hands twisted together, red raw from scrubbing. "She'd a right to be nervous. Any girl would." "Any girl wouldn't go missing for half an hour on her wedding day," said Mrs. Parry with the authority of a woman who had dispatched many brides to their proper destinations via telegrams and timetables. "What did you see?" "Only the veil hanging on the peg. And her bouquet weren't the same, as if the flowers had been, oh, I don't know." Ruby put her knuckles to her eyes. "I don't know anything at all." Guy Ellerton stood very straight under the churchyard elm. "Sergeant," he said evenly, "you will tell me now." Cotter hesitated, then inclined his head. "There's been a difficulty in Mill Lane. A motor lorry, new to the village, cut too close by the hedgerow and upset a cyclist. Miss Celia's bicycle was found by the ditch. The veil was tangled in the hedge. There's blood." "Dead?" It was Mr. Colling who asked, but the question ran like a draught through every mouth. Cotter fixed his eyes on a point somewhere above the bell tower. "No body. Not yet. A bicycle, a veil, a ditch." Miss Marple looked at the square of sun that fell across the lich gate and saw, as, She often did. A dozen small domestic scenes rushing into one another. A girl who knew the lanes like her sewing drawer. A lorry that did not belong to the pattern of the village. A veil that might tangle with the least provocation if one were careless, or if one wished for proof of an accident where accident was not. Blood, said the vicar faintly, as if the word itself were a failure of pastoral care. On the hedge, said Cotter, and on the comb that was lying nearby. The grandmother's comb, whispered Ruby, and began to cry in earnest. Miss Marple's blue eyes, which could look like faded forget-me-nots when they were not attending, brightened almost imperceptibly. She had known girls to fly, and brides to hesitate, and mothers to panic. She had known accidents and tragedies and the foolishness of men. She had also known that when a thing did not fit, it was generally because somebody had pressed it into the wrong drawer and hoped the drawer would close. Across the green, the tourist motor coach chose that inconvenient moment to arrive with a hiss of brakes and a clatter of cheerful ignorance. Cameras clicked at bunting and yews. A man with a check jacket and an optimistic moustache declared, "Charming," and asked if there would be a photograph of the bride by the pond. There was a moment of silence so absolute that the ducks themselves appeared to sink. "Not just now," said Miss Marple gently, and because she said it as she did, the man stepped back without quite knowing why. Somebody would go to the mill lane and peer at the hedge and mutter over the marks on the verge. Somebody would ask why a lorry had come where lorries did not, and how it had slipped away between field and field without being noticed by Mrs. Pennethorne, whose cottage window saw everything that ever happened on that road. Somebody would note that the bouquet had been remade. Fewer lilies, more hardy blooms, no powder pollen to stain white gloves. Somebody would wonder about the comb in the ditch and how such an heirloom chose to leap from hair that had been pinned, not 10 minutes prior, with the precision of a mother who could thread a needle in a thunderstorm. Miss Marple did not wonder, she observed. Then she arranged her face into its mildest expression and asked Ruby, in a voice thin as milk and every bit as nourishing, whether Miss Celia had liked orange blossom or preferred, as some modern girls did, to do without. Ruby sobbed that Miss Celia had hated orange blossom because it was too strong and chose instead a little spray of myrtle hidden under the bouquet. "Myrtle," said Miss Marple. "Yes, indeed. So very traditional when one wishes to appear modern." She tucked her gloves more securely at the wrist, and, with that implacable unhurriedness that marks the beginning of certain inevitabilities, moved with the others out into the bright, astonished morning, where the bride who never arrived waited to be found, or accounted. Year 4. Sergeant Cotter led a small party along Mill Lane while the village held its breath. Guy Ellerton walked beside him, contained and pale. Mr. Colling shadowed them. Mrs. Harbord kept a steady pace, forbiddingly composed. Miss Marple, neither hurried nor in the way, came like a quiet habit. The bicycle lay against the ditch with an air of having been placed rather than flung. The front wheel tilted. The bell was muddy. The chain, freshly oiled. The veil twined through hawthorn like a spent streamer. On a tuft of grass lay the tortoiseshell comb, its teeth clogged with a darker stain already drying. Ruby, arriving breathless, clapped both hands to her mouth. "Best not to touch," Cotter said, though he glanced at Miss Marple, unconsciously seeking the approval of a sensible aunt. He had Constable Mayhew mark positions with pebbles. Mrs. Harbord did not cry. She knelt and examined the bicycle. "Celia would not have left this so," she said. "She is neat, always." Her gaze slid to the veil and the hedge, where blood showed thinly on tender green. She would not have walked away with her hair disordered. Guy's jaw worked once. "Then someone took her," he said. Miss Marple's eyes travelled the lane as a needle travels a hem. The verge grass was crushed nearer the stile than near the bicycle. The dust bore 2 sets of tracks where motor tyres had gone slowly, then faster. Near the ditch, a trace of powder finer than the lane's chalk lay under nettles. She bent as if to tie her shoe, and the perfume from the ribbon at the porch returned, sharper here, almost theatrical. Cotter cleared his throat. There was a lorry, he said. Harry Tegg saw it early at the crossroads by Mrs. Pennythorne's. Foreign lettering, tarpaulin tied sloppy. Harry embroiders because his wife does, Miss Marple said. But he sees well when sober, and it is Saturday. Mr. Colling's mouth thinned. Delivery for the hall, perhaps. Or opportunity, said Miss Marple. The vicar, struggling with the fact of blood, kept to geography. It is private, he murmured. Hedged, and the lane bends. Mrs. Harbord rose. Her skirt brushed a pale smear on the mudguard. Celia rode here yesterday to call on Mrs. Pennythorne, she said. She returned in 20 minutes. The chain was oiled. Her throat moved. She is not careless. Nothing here is careless, Miss Marple said. Even the carelessness is tidied. 2 boys crept to watch and were shooed away. Miss Marple asked Ruby when the bouquet had last been in her hands. This morning, miss, Ruby hiccuped. I fetched it at 9:30. Miss Celia said Lily's made her sneeze, so Mrs. Withers put more fern. I pinned the veil in the parlour, then she sent me for the comb. Which is here, Miss Marple said, and yet the veil caught there. She indicated a bramble above the ditch. A tall girl might tangle it stepping down. A shorter girl would not. Celia is middle tall, Mrs. Harbord said too swiftly. Guy forced into the hedge and returned scratched. If she stumbled, she may be lying nearby. We are talking when we should search. We shall, Cotter agreed. Men beat the hedgerows in the copse beyond. Miss Marple stayed by the bicycle. She laid one gloved finger along the bell, where a faint smear of rouge coloured the metal. Mrs. Harbord, she said, was your daughter accustomed to cosmetics? Hardly at all, Mrs. Harbord replied. A touch of powder, perhaps. Then someone accustomed borrowed something briefly, Miss Marple murmured. Mr. Colling turned. What are you implying? That disguises are easier in villages than in London, because we are so sure we know one another, Miss Marple said. And that myrtle is a promise, not a guarantee. A shout went up. Cotter ran. Guy outpaced him. They returned with a scrap of satin and a handkerchief, monogrammed with a neat E entwined with a G. Mrs. Harbord stared. That is not Celia's, she said. She is a Harbord still. Guy looked at the handkerchief as if it had betrayed him. E.g., Ellerton Guy, he said hoarsely. From my drawer. Someone wanted you here and wanted you furious, Miss Marple said gently. He did not flare. He stood straight, very pale, while the village's idea of the story adjusted itself. Search the stream, Cotter ordered. Along to the old sluice. Ask at the hall about deliveries. Mr. Colling moved at once. Mrs. Harbord did not. She looked from comb to veil to bicycle, as if a pattern might declare itself if she refused to blink. Ruby sniffed and blurted, Miss Celia said she'd meet me by the yews if she didn't want to be seen. She laughed when she said it, but not happy. Not happy laughter is tidy too, Miss Marple said. She thought of the tourist coach and of a lorry with sloppy ties. Then she turned toward the church, because mothers break more neatly when someone holds the edges, and because truths often return to the place where ceremonies fail to happen. The return to the church was hushed, though no bell tolled and no announcement was given. People hovered in small clumps along the green, whispering in voices both anxious and speculative, each convinced that their own theory explained the bride's vanishing. Mrs. Withers, hands flour-streaked still from her morning baking, insisted it was a runaway romance. Girls will change their minds at the very altar, she said firmly, though her own daughter had never had the opportunity. Mrs. Parry from the post office, less romantic and more censorious, muttered darkly of scandal, certain that the missing bride had been lured or threatened. Even the children had ceased their games, solemn now as they watched the grown-ups' disarray. Within the cool dimness of the nave, Miss Marple sat once more in her pew, knitting needles clicking softly. Her expression gave no indication of the tumbling speculations about lorries and combs and smudges of rouge. She preferred her patterns simple, a dropped stitch here, a snagged thread there, and soon enough the garment betrayed what had been poorly done. She had always found village tragedies more revealing than London ones, because London supplied too much noise. In villages, people could not help but display themselves. Sergeant Cotter had set the constable to rouse every cottage along Mill Lane, but his face betrayed unease when he returned. "Nobody saw her past the bend," he said, "and Mrs. Pennethorne, who sees everything, swears she was watching the lane at that very hour. The only thing she noticed was a lorry turning out to the main road. Grey canvas, foreign script on the side. The groom, Guy Ellerton, stood rigid against a pillar. His voice was low and controlled. So she vanished in the space between my house and this church, with 30 people expecting her. That is not a lark, Sergeant." "Nor is it certain foul play, sir," Cotter replied, though without conviction. "It may be." "May be what?" Mr. Colling interjected sharply. "Celia is not a child to hide in the hedgerows. She would not humiliate her family or her fiancé." His words carried the polished assurance of a man used to smoothing difficulties. Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered to him once, then dropped back to her knitting. A little too polished, she thought. Words polished like brass seldom wore that particular anxious sheen. Mrs. Harbord, who until then had preserved her dignity by silence, spoke in a voice brittle as spun glass. "My daughter would not, could not, leave us in this manner. I raised her to respect duty, to finish what she began. No Harbord would abscond, even for love." Her hands gripped the pew in front of her, steadying herself against the tremor that threatened her composure. Miss Marple noted the use of the word love. It had not been prompted, not summoned, but slipped through with the force of something too near the surface. Love, or perhaps fear of it. The vicar, distressed and blinking, proposed prayer. A few villagers knelt, others murmured assent, but most lingered with the restless air of spectators cheated of their drama. They drifted outside again, eager for scraps of information. Miss Marple remained seated until the press had thinned. Then, tucking away her knitting, she rose with unhurried calm and approached Ruby, the parlour-maid, who had taken refuge against a pillar. "You are quite sure," Miss Marple said gently, "that Miss Celia asked for the comb just then?" Ruby's lashes were wet, her face blotched with tears. "Yes, miss. She laughed, but it was, oh, like when you laugh to make something lighter than you feel. She said she couldn't go without it. And then she told me, if she wasn't waiting at the parlour, she'd be by the yews. She'd a way of saying things, like she wanted to give me a puzzle." Miss Marple patted her arm. "You are a sensible girl. I dare say puzzles are not your favourite occupation." Ruby shook her head, almost smiling despite herself. "No, miss. I like things plain." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "So do murderers usually. It is only when they try to be clever that we begin to see the joins." Ruby stared, startled, but Miss Marple had already moved away, her small figure blending again into the shadows of the church. She did not waste words. One must allow others to speak, to speculate, to contradict themselves, before the truth peeped out in an unguarded phrase. By late afternoon, the search party returned empty-handed. The bicycle and veil remained the only certain evidence, and the handkerchief with the groom's monogram still rested uneasily in Cotter's pocket. Mrs. Harbord had retreated to the vicarage drawing-room, stiff-backed and wordless, while Guy paced like a man caged. Mr. Colling hovered, solicitous but too eager, too insistent in his reassurances. Miss Marple accepted a cup of weak tea from the vicar's wife and sipped it slowly. She asked one question, very mild. "Did anyone notice the flowers changed?" The vicar's wife blinked. "Changed?" "The bouquet this morning was not as it was yesterday," Miss Marple murmured. "Less lily, more fern. A girl prone to sneezing would certainly prefer it, but it does suggest an afterthought. Someone touched it after it was arranged." Guy stopped pacing. "You think someone tampered with it?" "Oh, I think brides are rarely left entirely alone on their wedding day," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "Too many hands fussing over this and that. It is so easy for one hand to do more than the others." Outside, the gossip thickened. Some spoke of an elopement with a mysterious stranger, others of a family quarrel too great to be borne. A few whispered of darker matters. But Miss Marple listened not to the chatter, but to the silences between it. The things people avoided mentioning, the sideways glances, the hurried denials. Already threads began to weave themselves into a pattern, though the cloth was far from finished. As twilight gathered, Sergeant Cotter announced his intention to search the Ellerton house itself, to which Guy gave curt consent. The villagers dispersed reluctantly, their disappointment veiled as sympathy. Miss Marple, walking slowly toward the green, paused beneath the yews. She touched the rough bark with a gloved hand and glanced once more at the empty path. Brides were expected to walk down aisles, not vanish into hedgerows. But expectations, in her long experience, were precisely what murderers relied upon. She set her hat firmly against the rising evening breeze and thought very quietly that someone in Little Ambrose had arranged this disappearance with more precision than any bouquet. Sergeant Cotter's search of the White House by the mill stream began politely, with Guy, Ellerton standing aside, and Mr. Colling volunteering an inventory that sounded rehearsed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Broom, opened and shut doors with the air of someone who would rather lock them. She kept her thin hands flat against her apron and answered questions in an even tone that never quite reached the eyes. Miss Marple, who had come under the pretext of taking Ruby out of everyone's way, drifted from room to room with the soft inattentiveness of a woman looking for her spectacles and seeing everything. In the front chamber, the bridal gown lay across the bed. Beside it, the long gloves and a little satin shoe waited like punctuation. The veil's comb had left a faint arc upon the dressing table. A powder puff lay open, a lipstick had rolled to rest against the mirror frame, a blush of rouge rimmed a silver dish. She dressed here, Cotter said, and went out by the side door to where the bicycle stands, straight forward. Straight lines are beloved by men who make roads, Miss Marple murmured. Women tend to leave curves. Guy, who had not sat, said with patience now frayed, "If you have a suggestion, Miss Marple, I would be grateful for it plain." She smiled. "Only that I do not think Miss Celia left in haste. When a girl makes up in a hurry, there is too much of everything. This is tidy." Mrs. Broom set her mouth. Miss Celia was always neat. She would never— "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And yet someone changed the bouquet after 9:30. May I see where it was kept?" Mrs. Broom led them to the back parlour. On the settle lay string, wire and browning fern ends. A florist's crate with Mrs. Withers's stencil sat beneath the table, and in the coal scuttle, half hidden, lay a single lily head, its anthers clipped. "Clipped to avoid stains," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Withers would have done that," Mrs. Broom replied quickly. "She prefers to supply them intact," Miss Marple said softly. Cotter made a note. "Who had access here between 9 and 10? "Everyone and no one," Mrs. Broom said. "The door is never locked on a wedding morning. I was in the kitchen. Ruby ran messages. Mr. Ellerton and Mr. Colling were in the study. Miss Celia came down twice, once for the bouquet and once for a ribbon." "A ribbon?" "White satin to tie the stems. She said it would lie better." Miss Marple turned to the study. It was a masculine room of books newly acquired. On the desk lay a vellum folder and visiting cards with Guy Ellerton's name. The handkerchief drawer was half open, and the row of E.G. squares showed a gap. "How many did you bring from town?" Cotter asked. "A dozen," Guy said. "One is missing, as we know." Miss Marple asked, casually, whether Mrs. Pennethorne could see the back of the house. Mr. Colling answered too quickly that a high hedge prevented it. Guy added that a person could pass unseen along the mill path in 2 minutes. From the scullery came the muffled sound of a girl crying. Miss Marple found Ruby kneeling by a mop pail. "It is best to cry when nobody says not to," she told her. "Then one can wash one's face and see properly." Ruby sniffed. "I keep thinking of the yews. She said she'd be there if she didn't want to be seen." Of whom would she not wish to be seen? Ruby shook her head. There's been quarrels about money for the house. Mr. Ellerton wants pipes and new stoves. Mrs. Harbord said not to ruin old walls. Miss Celia stood between. But that's only talk. Talk hardens like plaster when the weather is right, Miss Marple said. Did Miss Celia know anyone who wore strong scent? Mrs. Broom uses violet on Sundays. Mrs. Withers smells of sugar. Miss Celia's cousin from Exeter smells of something French and too sweet. The cousin, said Miss Marple. The one in blue. By then, Cotter had finished. He proposed calling at the hall about deliveries and at Mrs. Pennethorne's. Guy assented and prepared to go with him. Mrs. Broom stood motionless. At the doorway, Miss Marple paused. Mrs. Broom, will you look in the coal scuttle once more? When brides change their minds, they hide the evidence in a drawer. When someone wishes us to think a bride changed her mind, they hide it where a woman would never put it and a man would never notice. Under coal, for instance. Mrs. Broom's cheeks flamed. She lifted the scoop. Beneath the lily head lay a twist of white satin, soiled at the edge, its centre stiffened with powder, and what might have been soap. Cotter looked at Miss Marple. It was tied on after the bouquet was made, Miss Marple said gently, and used to wipe something. I dare say we shall learn what, when Mrs. Pennethorne tells us what she saw without knowing it. Very quietly. Mrs. Pennethorne, when questioned, received them on her cottage threshold with the air of a woman delighted at last to be of consequence. She was a small person with a sharp nose and a sharper tongue, who prided herself on seeing things others missed. Yet, when Miss Marple folded her hands and asked what she had observed from her window on the morning of the wedding, Mrs. Pennethorne became unexpectedly cautious. I saw the lorry, she said at once, before any other question was put. Great ugly thing it was, with a canvas cover tied any which way. Foreign writing down the side. German, I shouldn't wonder. It rattled past the hedge just before 10:30. Strange it should come this way, since there's nothing along the lane but the mill stream. She paused, eyes narrowing. And then, well, nothing more. Not a soul walking behind it, not a bicycle following. I told Sergeant Cotter so. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze serene. And yet, you were watching continuously. Well, Mrs. Pennethorne smoothed her apron. One cannot stare forever. The kettle boiled over, and I turned for a moment. But there was no one there when I looked again. Just the dust settling. Guy Ellerton, impatient, broke in. You must have seen Celia pass. She cannot have vanished into thin air. Mrs. Pennethorne gave him a look of sour satisfaction. If I'd seen her, I should have said so. Brides are not exactly invisible, Mr. Ellerton. Miss Marple's tone was mild. Sometimes they are made invisible, Mrs. Pennethorne, not by magic but by expectation. One notices what one expects, and what one does not expect may slip by entirely. That remark silenced the little woman more effectively than rebuke. She pursed her lips and offered nothing further. But Miss Marple had seen the flicker of something unspoken, an uneasiness that did not sit comfortably with her neighbour's natural relish for gossip. As they walked back along the lane, Cotter muttered, She knows more than she'll say. Afraid of looking a fool, likely. Miss Marple shook her head. Afraid of seeming unkind, perhaps. She saw something that did not fit her picture, and so she thrust it away. People do it all the time. Back at the vicarage the group dispersed. Cotter to file his report, Guy to wrestle with his fury in silence, and Mr. Colling to attend to Mrs. Harbord, who sat stiffly in the drawing-room with untouched tea. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the garden, her eyes moving over the flower-beds with their clipped edges and orderly blooms. Ruby came out carrying cups to be washed, her steps weary. Ruby, Miss Marple said softly, when you returned with the comb and found Miss Celia gone, was anything else altered in the parlour? Ruby thought hard. Only the bouquet, miss. It wasn't in the same spot, and there were petals on the floor like someone had cut or changed it. But I thought Mrs. Broom had tidied it. Miss Marple smiled kindly. A very good memory. Such little differences often tell the truth more than grand gestures. As evening fell, news spread quickly that no body had been found in the stream, nor in the copse beyond. The absence of a corpse should have been reassuring, but instead it thickened the unease. Villagers whispered now of abduction, of scandal, of debts unpaid. Every theory seemed to find its champion. Miss Marple retired early, though she did not sleep. She sat in her neat guest room at the vicarage, her knitting untouched on her lap, and considered. The lorry, the bouquet, the comb, the ribbon, the smear of rouge, all odd scraps, each unimportant alone. But together they hinted at something deliberate, something contrived. Brides do not simply vanish on their wedding morning, and when things are arranged too neatly to suggest an accident, it is nearly always because they were arranged. The next morning, before church bells rang for matins, Miss Marple was already walking the lane. She paused at the stile near the ditch, where the bicycle had been found, and studied the ground again. She stooped slowly, like any elderly lady stiff in the back, and with one careful finger traced the faint print pressed into the dust. Heel marks, narrow, set very close together, walking deliberately rather than stumbling. Celia had not fallen here. She had stepped down. A rustle in the hedge startled her. It was only Ruby, sent to fetch water from the stream. She looked frightened to find Miss Marple there so early. "I couldn't sleep, miss. I keep thinking something terrible's happened." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "Something has happened, my dear. But terrible things often show themselves in very ordinary guises, and ordinary people, when pressed, reveal more than they mean to." Her eyes travelled up the lane, where the hedge bent out of sight. The villagers might still be debating whether Celia had fled, been struck down, or carried away. But to Miss Marple, the question was already sharpening. Not what had happened, for that would soon enough declare itself, but who had prepared it, and why. The truth was waiting patiently, like a thread pulled half loose. It only needed a hand light enough to draw it out without breaking it. She turned back toward the village, walking slowly, the corners of her mouth turned in the faintest of smiles. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves, though the picture they formed was not yet one she would share. Not until the right moment, when concealment turned itself into confession. By Sunday afternoon, the village was a hive of theories, and none of them satisfied Sergeant Cotter. He had questioned every passer-by on the road to the next town, and yet no one claimed to have seen Celia after she left her mother's parlour. The lorry had been traced as far as the main road, but beyond that the description grew too vague. Foreign letters, grey canvas, a careless driver, nothing definite enough to follow. The absence of a body, rather than calming the household, only deepened the unease, for if Celia were alive, she surely would have sent word by now. At the vicarage, where Miss Marple still lodged, callers came and went, all with information they considered vital. Mrs. Withers insisted she had sold the bouquet intact, and suggested darkly that Mrs. Harbord's disapproval of the marriage might explain everything. The cousin from Exeter, pale in her wrinkled blue gown, declared she had seen a figure slipping through the trees near the green just before the wedding hour, though she could not swear it was Celia. Ruby hovered anxiously, willing to help, though her recollections tumbled over one another in confusion. Miss Marple listened to them all with her usual patience. She had learned long ago that people betray more in their attempts to appear helpful than in silence. She noted how Mrs. Withers avoided speaking of her assistant, a boy known for pilfering coins, how the cousin's account grew vaguer each time it was repeated, how Ruby, though devoted, seemed particularly troubled by the mention of Mrs. Broom, the housekeeper. That evening, as the vicar's wife poured tea, Miss Marple asked very mildly whether Mrs. Broom had always been in the Harbord household. "Some years," the vicar's wife replied, lowering her voice. "A capable woman, though distant. She came after Mr. Harbord died. Reliable in her duties but not loved. Celia never seemed quite at ease with her, though nothing was ever said." Miss Marple smiled her thin smile. Sometimes service conceals more than polish on silver. The next morning, Cotter, determined to press further, assembled a formal search party. Men tramped the stream's edge, dragged the shallow pools, combed the hedgerows. Nothing emerged save for a torn scrap of fabric that proved to be from a labourer's jacket and a child's marble glinting in the grass. The bicycle and veil remained the only true relics. Yet as Miss Marple followed them quietly along the lane, she paused by the stile again. She bent, her eyes close to the ground, and saw once more the narrow heel prints, set deliberately, almost daintily. A bride hurrying to her wedding would not have stepped so carefully. It was not the haste of nerves, but the measure of someone arranging how they should be seen. Returning to the square, she found Guy Ellerton standing stiffly before the villagers, answering their questions with a courtesy so taut it might snap. His voice betrayed nothing, yet his hand trembled as he lit a cigarette. Mr. Colling hovered at his side, urging him to leave the crowd, to let the police manage matters. Miss Marple watched the two men closely. The best man's concern was perhaps too eager, too protective, as though his role extended beyond friendship. That evening she found an opportunity to speak privately with Ruby, who sat polishing silver at the vicarage kitchen table. The girl started when Miss Marple entered, then tried to smile. "I can't think straight, miss. Every time I shut my eyes I see her veil in the hedge." Miss Marple settled herself opposite. "My dear, it is better sometimes to say what troubles one most. Small details dismissed in fear often grow dangerous in silence." "Did Miss Celia ever confide in you? Something she might not have told her family?" Ruby hesitated, twisting her cloth. "Only once. She said she wished people would see her for herself, not for the family name or the house or what she was expected to marry. She said sometimes she wished she might go where nobody knew her, but she laughed straight after and said she was foolish." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It is not foolish to wish to be seen clearly. Many a girl has felt the same on her wedding day. But tell me, when you fetched the comb, did you notice if her gloves were still on the dressing table?" Ruby frowned, surprised. "Yes, they were. The long satin pair. I thought she'd forgotten them, but she never came back for them." "That is interesting," Miss Marple murmured, "for a bride does not step out barehanded unless she does not mean to be seen as a bride." The following morning, Cotter announced that he must take formal statements from the household. Mrs. Harbord answered with her customary cold dignity, insisting her daughter would never have abandoned her duty. Guy responded with short, controlled replies, his jaw set. Mr. Colling spoke fluently, almost too fluently, about the groom's distress and the village's idle speculation. Mrs. Broom, when called, folded her hands and claimed to know nothing beyond her duties. Yet as she rose to leave, Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of violet scent clinging to her sleeve, though the housekeeper had denied ever using perfume, except on Sundays. When the interviews were done, Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicar's garden. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, but beneath it she caught a whiff of something sharper, like powder overused, clinging unnaturally. She thought again of the smudge on the bicycle bell, the satin ribbon stained with soap and rouge, the bouquet altered after it was arranged. It was a careful stage setting, designed to mislead, to show an accident or an elopement. And yet the one thing it could not hide was intention. By evening, unease had settled like a fog across Little Ambrose. People locked their doors earlier than usual, though the summer dusk lingered. The ducks on the pond quacked into silence. Inside the vicarage, Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly and looked toward the window. Somewhere close at hand, someone was waiting for the village to believe the story that had been arranged. And yet the very neatness of that arrangement betrayed the hand that fashioned it. She thought of Celia's missing gloves, of the laughter that was not happy, of the cousin from Exeter with her cloying scent, of Mrs. Broom's stiff hands. One of them had helped, one had hindered, and one had watched without understanding. But which had turned a wedding day into a performance that ended with an empty aisle? Miss Marple drew a breath, slow and certain. The next step would be to test the tale, to see who flinched when the pattern was tugged. The time was coming soon. The following morning broke pale and uncertain, with mist curling low over the mill stream and the cottages of Little Ambrose holding their shutters longer than usual. A silence seemed to have settled over the village, a silence compounded of waiting and of fear. The congregation that had gathered hopefully for a wedding only days before now spoke in low tones of disappearance and suspicion. Though no constable had yet uttered the word murder, the villagers carried it on their lips with the relish of a forbidden fruit. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the vicarage breakfast room, accepted her tea and porridge with her usual gentleness, but her eyes were far away. She recalled Ruby's troubled account of Celia's gloves lying untouched on the dressing table, the cousin's inconsistent tale of a shadowy figure among the trees, and the faint whiff of violet scent lingering upon Mrs. Broom's sleeve. Such things would seem to others too slight to matter, but Miss Marple had long known that it is precisely in such trifles that truth insists upon peeping through. Sergeant Cotter arrived before noon with news that the lorry had been traced at last as far as the turnpike road. The driver, a foreigner with halting English, claimed he had passed through the village but denied any knowledge of a bride or a bicycle. He carried a consignment of timber and his papers were in order. Cotter, who distrusted neat alibis, was unsatisfied but had no grounds to hold the man further. Guy Ellerton received the report with a grim nod, but Mr. Colling burst forth indignantly, declaring that the police were wasting their time chasing shadows. "The lorry is a red herring," he insisted. "What we should be asking is whether Celia herself chose to disappear. The pressure of family duty, the weight of expectation, such burdens could drive a girl to folly." Miss Marple, who had been examining the embroidery on her handkerchief as if it held her entire attention, looked up with mild eyes. "It is certainly possible, Mr. Colling, though when young ladies choose to vanish of their own accord, they seldom take the trouble to scatter bloodstains on hedges, and they almost always remember to take their gloves." The remark, offered in her mildest tones, silenced Colling more effectively than rebuke. His mouth closed upon a retort, and a faint colour rose in his cheeks. Miss Marple did not pursue the point. She preferred to sow her observations lightly, allowing them to root in their own time. Later that day, she walked once more toward the mill lane, her small figure unobtrusive among the hedgerows. She paused by the stile where the bicycle had been found and studied the ground with care. The heel prints remained visible, though blurred now by weather and feet. She bent slowly, retrieving from the grass a tiny scrap of netting, torn and faintly perfumed. It was not from the veil, she judged, but from a piece of undertrimming, a delicate adornment not easily dislodged unless deliberately caught. She tucked it into her reticule and continued her slow circuit. At the bend of the lane, where the hedges grew thickest, she found Mrs. Pennethorne waiting with an air of aggrieved importance. The little woman had clearly been rehearsing her account for any listener who would have it. "I've remembered something more, Miss Marple," she declared. "When the lorry passed, I thought I saw another figure at the corner, only for a moment, mind you. A woman in grey stepping back into the hedge. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, but perhaps it was not. Grey is such an unmemorable colour." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "It is most helpful of you to recall it, Mrs. Pennethorne. Grey is indeed very convenient when one wishes not to be remarked. And did you notice whether the figure was tall or short?" Mrs. Pennethorne frowned. "Not tall, I think. Closer to my height. But I cannot be certain." Miss Marple thanked her gently and moved on. She had no need to press further. A woman in grey, short, stepping into the hedge. The image fitted too neatly with another she carried in her mind. It was not Celia's height Mrs. Pennethorne had glimpsed, but someone else's. That evening, at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire while the vicar and his wife discussed the strange turn events had taken. Ruby, clearing the tea things, lingered at the door. "Begging your pardon, miss," she whispered, "but I've thought of something. When I went to fetch the comb, I passed Mr. Colling on the stairs. He had a speck of powder on his sleeve, though he brushed it away quick when he saw me. I didn't think of it then. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It is often in retrospect that things acquire their meaning, my dear. Powder on a sleeve, violet scent on another. One might almost think half the household had been dressing for the part. Ruby's eyes widened, but Miss Marple said no more. She returned to her knitting, her needles flashing gently in the firelight, her thoughts weaving patterns more intricate than any she could produce in wool. By Monday, the village had grown restless with waiting. Some openly doubted Celia would ever be found. Others insisted she would reappear suddenly with a tale of romantic escapade. The uncertainty gnawed at every conversation, every gesture. Miss Marple observed with particular interest how Mrs. Harbord avoided speaking of her daughter's happiness, focusing instead on duty and appearances. Guy Ellerton grew more withdrawn, answering questions only when pressed. Mr. Colling, in contrast, seemed determined to fill every silence, talking too much, too fast, as though afraid of what silence might disclose. Miss Marple watched them all with the patience of a gardener watching seeds germinate. The truth, she knew, had already been sown. It only awaited the moment to show its first green shoots, and when it did, it would point not merely to what had happened in Mill Lane, but to the very heart of why Celia Harbord had vanished on the morning of her wedding, leaving behind a veil in the hedge and a village in fearful disarray. Monday evening brought with it a weary dampness, the kind that made even familiar cottages seem closed in upon themselves. Curtains twitched as Sergeant Cotter made his way toward the White House by the mill stream for yet another round of questions. The villagers watched with barely concealed eagerness, their gossip fed by the steady drip of uncertainty. A bride lost without trace was far more compelling than a bride safely wed. The Ellerton house glowed faintly with lamplight, but inside the atmosphere was tense, each word clipped and weighted. Guy Ellerton received the sergeant in the study, his features stern and controlled. Mr. Colling lingered near the mantel, pretending nonchalance while offering cigarettes too often, as though the gesture might distract from his own unease. Mrs. Harbord sat rigid in a high-backed chair, her eyes fixed on the fire that gave little heat. Mrs. Broom hovered discreetly in the doorway, her hands folded in a way that suggested obedience, though her gaze flicked often toward the table, where the bridal bouquet, now wilting, still lay. Cotter began his questions with practiced formality, yet every answer seemed to fall flat. Guy repeated that he had seen Celia last in the parlour, prepared to leave, her veil arranged and her bouquet in hand. He insisted she had shown no hesitation, no sign of doubt. Mr. Colling supported this account, though his words came a little too smoothly, as though rehearsed. Mrs. Harbord spoke little, but when pressed she admitted her daughter had been unusually quiet at breakfast. A thoughtful mood, she called it, though her voice trembled on the phrase. It was Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner with her knitting, who asked the question that shifted the room. "Forgive me," she said in her gentle tone, "but I wonder, was the ribbon on the bouquet the same one used yesterday evening?" The silence that followed was telling. Mrs. Broom straightened, her lips parting as though to answer, then pressed them together again. It was Mr. Colling who finally replied. "Naturally it was the same. Why should it not be?" Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Because a fresh ribbon was tied after 9 o'clock, and the one removed was found soiled and tucked away under coal. Brides are not in the habit of discarding white satin in such fashion." Cotter turned sharply to Mrs. Broom, who paled but kept her composure. "I know nothing of it," she said firmly. "The flowers were as they were given. I merely placed the bouquet where Miss Celia could reach it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Ah, but one must ask oneself who benefits by making it appear the bouquet was altered. It suggests a nervous bride fussing at the last moment, does it not? When in fact it might only suggest that someone wished to leave behind the impression of nervousness." Guy's jaw tightened. "If you are hinting at deliberate deception, Miss Marple, I should like to know to what end. My wife, my intended, would never have lent herself to such a performance. No, said Miss Marple softly. "I do not think she would," which makes it all the more certain that someone else arranged it for her. The conversation broke off uneasily, Cotter promising further inquiries. Yet Miss Marple noticed the quick flash of resentment in Mr. Collins' glance and the rigid way Mrs. Broom's hands clutched her apron. Neither response, she reflected, belonged to innocence. Later, as she left the house, Miss Marple took a slow turn through the garden. The air smelt of damp earth and fading roses. Near the side gate, she paused, bending to examine the gravel. The light was poor, but her eyes were accustomed to detail. There, faint but discernible, was the imprint of narrow heels. Several steps, leading not toward the lane, but back toward the shrubbery. She followed them a little way, her small figure half lost in the gloom, and found where the prints ended abruptly near the garden wall. Above them, the ivy was crushed, as if by someone climbing or being helped over. She returned thoughtfully to the vicarage, saying nothing of her discovery yet. It was not her way to shout of evidence before she had weighed its worth. Instead, she allowed the evening to pass with quiet conversation, nodding as the vicar's wife lamented the effect of the scandal upon parish life, and smiling when Ruby brought in the tea with anxious hands. Only when she was alone did she take from her reticule the scrap of netting found on the lane and hold it up to the lamplight. It was faintly dusted with powder and carried that same artificial scent she had noticed on the bicycle ribbon. The next day, the search widened. Constables combed the mill stream again, others questioned travellers on the road, yet no trace of Celia emerged. The villagers grew more restless, their theories louder and more extravagant. Some whispered of blackmail, others of a secret lover. A few even hinted that Guy Ellerton himself might have engineered the disappearance to escape the match. Miss Marple observed how these rumours spread and to whom they clung, for gossip, she knew, is rarely random. At noon, when Cotter confessed his frustration over the lack of progress, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and said gently, "It is sometimes wise to look not at where the bride vanished, but at who benefits by her vanishing. One sees such patterns in the village often enough, an inheritance delayed, a scandal forestalled, or even a love misplaced." Cotter frowned. "Do you believe it's someone close to her?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that those who arrange scenes so carefully do not act at a distance. They must be near enough to adjust the flowers, to borrow the ribbon, to alter the story, just so." That evening she walked once more to the yews near the church, recalling Ruby's words about Celia's promise to wait there, if she wished not to be seen. The place was quiet, but upon the grass she noticed something others had missed, a faint indentation, as though a small case had rested there briefly, a vanity case perhaps, or a bag. Beside it, pressed into the soil, was the print of a man's heavier boot, half overlapping the delicate impression. Miss Marple stood very still, her gloved hands folded before her. A picture was forming at last, a bride prepared with care, led aside at the last moment, her absence disguised by false traces, her path concealed with studied misdirection. It was clever, yes, but too clever. For every disguise leaves behind the shadow of its own making, and shadows, Miss Marple knew, are easier to follow than the thing they conceal. When she returned to the vicarage, she was smiling faintly. She had seen enough to be certain that the truth lay very close at hand. What remained was to test it, to nudge the careful mask until the cracks revealed themselves. And in that testing, she thought, someone would betray themselves not by what they said, but by what they could not keep from showing. The following morning dawned clearer, the mist lifting from the mill stream, as if the village itself were trying to shake off the uncertainty that had settled upon it. But little Ambrose was restless still. At the bakery counter, Mrs. Withers whispered that the police would never find Celia alive, while Mrs. Parry at the post office declared with relish that the girl must have run away with someone unsuitable, and that sooner or later the truth would fall out in a letter posted from London. Yet beneath the clamour of theories there was a deeper unease, as though each villager sensed that the explanation would be neither simple nor comfortable. Miss Marple moved quietly through this murmur of speculation, her small figure unremarkable against the bustle of the square. She paused to exchange pleasantries, nodded to a neighbour's remark, and accepted a bun from Mrs. Withers, without appearing to notice the woman's hunger for gossip. But behind her mild eyes, thoughts clicked into place, like the careful stitches of her knitting. She had seen enough of disguises and too careful staging to know that this disappearance was not a flight of nerves, nor an accident with a lorry. It was an arrangement, and arrangements always betrayed the arranger. Sergeant Cotter, harried by the villagers' insistence on updates, found himself at the vicarage again by mid-morning. His report was thin. The lorry driver's alibi held. No traces had been discovered beyond what they already knew, and the stream yielded nothing more than broken branches and startled ducks. "It's like she's vanished into the air," Cotter muttered, slamming his notebook shut. Miss Marple's voice, soft as ever, broke the silence. "Not into the air, Sergeant. Into the hands of someone who knew precisely how to make her vanish. You have been looking for where she went, but perhaps the more fruitful question is who needed her not to arrive." Guy Ellerton, who had come in to hear the report, stiffened. His face was pale, but his voice firm. "If you mean to imply she had enemies, you are mistaken. Celia was loved, too gentle to inspire malice." Miss Marple gave him a kind look. "Ah, but love and malice are sometimes separated only by a thread, Mr. Ellerton. Disappointment, jealousy, resentment. These often wear the mask of affection until the moment they are forced into the light." Mr. Colling, who had followed Guy like a shadow, interjected quickly, too quickly. "You suggest someone close to her plotted this? Absurd. What possible motive could there be?" His hand trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, the match flaring brighter than his control allowed. Miss Marple only smiled faintly and resumed her knitting. She had planted her seed and knew better than to water it with too much urgency. People revealed themselves most readily when they believed they were deflecting suspicion. That afternoon, she took Ruby with her to the churchyard, ostensibly to tend the flowers at a neglected grave. As they worked, Miss Marple asked quietly, "Did you ever notice how Mr. Colling looks at Miss Celia?" Ruby dropped a trowel. "Oh, miss, I shouldn't say—" "It is often better to say than to hold it in," Miss Marple encouraged. Ruby flushed. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, he looked at her too long, not the way a best man ought. But Miss Celia never noticed, or pretended she didn't. She only ever smiled politely, as if she wished to be somewhere else. Once, in the kitchen, I heard Mrs. Broom say to him, "You'll spoil everything if you carry on so." He told her to hold her tongue. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained calm. "That is most helpful, my dear. It is always useful to know who notices too much, and who tells others not to notice at all." In the evening, as the vicar's wife set supper, Miss Marple excused herself for a stroll. She walked back toward the Ellerton house, her steps slow but purposeful. The prints she had seen in the gravel by the garden wall still troubled her. They had not been Celia's, but they told of someone short, stepping with care, climbing or aiding another to climb. She paused at the ivy again, touched the crushed leaves, and considered. A bride, in full dress, would hardly scale a wall. But someone in plain attire, arranging the illusion of disappearance, might do so to carry away what the others must not find. When she returned, she found Guy seated stiffly in the vicar's drawing-room, staring at the fire. Mr. Colling stood near him, speaking in low, urgent tones. Miss Marple settled herself in a chair and busied her hands with her knitting, saying nothing. It was enough to listen. "I tell you, Guy," Colling said, his voice strained, "the village is turning against you. They whisper already that you had reason to rid yourself of her. If you allow this to continue, it will destroy your standing here before you've even begun." Guy's answer was cold. "If they whisper such lies, then let them. I have nothing to fear from the truth. Miss Marple's needles clicked. "The truth does tend to reveal itself, Mr. Ellerton," she said softly, "often in the very moment when someone is most anxious to prevent it." Colling started, colour rising in his cheeks. "Are we to be cross-examined in our own sitting room by an elderly lady with her knitting?" Miss Marple smiled at him with quiet kindness. "Elderly ladies, Mr. Colling, often notice things others do not. For example, how very quick you are to answer for Mr. Ellerton, almost as if you fear silence might speak louder than words." The room fell still. Guy's eyes shifted toward his friend, doubt flickering at last across his stern expression. Colling opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again. He dropped his cigarette into the grate with unnecessary force. Miss Marple bent her head once more to her knitting, satisfied. The time was coming when she would draw the net tight. For now it was enough that she had sown doubt in the right place, and that she had confirmed what she suspected. Celia's vanishing was not the work of strangers nor of fate, but of those within her own circle. The threads were nearly all gathered. What remained was to weave them into the pattern of revelation. Miss Marple asked the vicar's wife to arrange a small tea on Tuesday at 4 for the comfort of those most troubled, and invitations went to Mrs. Harbord, Guy Ellerton, Mr. Colling, Mrs. Broom, and the cousin from Exeter. Ruby brought cake, the vicar poured. A vase of lilies in the bow window shed its dust. They came stiffly. Mrs. Harbord's chin was high. Guy looked bloodless. Mr. Colling fussed with the cups. Mrs. Broom hovered, hands folded. The cousin drifted in a cloud of sweetness. "You are kind, Miss Marple," Mrs. Harbord said. "I trust there is news." "There is comfort," Miss Marple said. "News often follows when comfort loosens tongues." She lifted the window bouquet, lilies and fern, and offered it round. The cousin sneezed. Mr. Colling stepped forward too quickly with a handkerchief. Miss Marple noted the neat E entwined with a G, the style found in Mill Lane. "Habit," Colling said. "Especially with lilies," Miss Marple agreed. "They stain, unless one clips the anthers." "I clip for church on Saturdays," Mrs. Broom said. "But not this Saturday," Miss Marple returned. "Mrs. Withers sends flowers complete. Someone clipped after the bouquet left her shop." "Celia could not bear lilies," Guy said. "No," Miss Marple said, "which is why she would not have stood here." She pinched a fallen stamen. "It clings to satin." She set down the bouquet. "When things are tidy," she said. "I recall the Sunday school play where a child hid backstage and someone arranged a fallen curtain to prove the wind had visited us. People tidy their deceptions as they tidy drawers." Guy's mouth tightened. "If you mean someone arranged an accident, say so." "Not an accident," Miss Marple said gently. "A disappearance. The veil in the hedge, the bicycle placed, the handkerchief conveniently monogrammed. Considerate touches. Yet the heel prints by the stile were not a nervous girl's. They were a careful woman's, short in the foot, stepping deliberately." Mrs. Broom's fingers pinched her apron. "And the ivy by your garden wall," Miss Marple went on. "Crushed where a person of that same height might climb or help another up. A bride in full dress does not climb. A woman in grey might, to pass something over to a waiting hand beyond." "What hand?" Colling demanded. "A friend's," Miss Marple said. "One who talks when silence would serve. One who produces the right handkerchief at the right sneeze. One eager to tell a groom what to think before he thinks it." Colour rose and vanished in Colling's face. "I have asked Sergeant Cotter to invite the lorry driver to the square tomorrow," Miss Marple added. "He says a woman flagged him on Mill Lane just after the bell's half hour. Grey coat, small, with a bundle to toss under the canvas. He cannot say what it was, but he can say to whom he handed a handkerchief when the lady complained of dust." Silence held. Mrs. Broom made a sound like a hinge. Guy stared at his friend. Mrs. Harbord touched her pearls. Colling laughed too loudly. "Really, this theatre—" "Not theatre," Miss Marple said. "Rehearsal. The performance was Saturday." She brushed pollen from her sleeve. When a woman who loathes lilies leaves no mark upon gloves because she wore none, and the ribbon that tied her bouquet is found stiff with powder and soap in a place no bride would hide it, one concludes another hand wiped away what should have shown. When the cousin remembers and forgets conveniently, when the housekeeper smells of Sunday's violet on Monday, when the best man carries handkerchiefs oddly ready, one sees a plan, not chance. Mrs. Harbord spoke at last, hoarse. "Where is my child?" "Alive," Miss Marple said. Guy made an inarticulate sound. "In a safe but foolish place," she went on. "Moved there under the pretext of sparing her a scene. Tomorrow we shall collect her. First, it is time to decide whether those who arranged this kindness will trust the truth or force me to finish the story without their help." Mrs. Broom's hands unclasped. "If I speak," she said, not looking at anyone, "it is to spare Miss Celia further talk." "Truth spares more than talk," Miss Marple said. But it was Mr. Colling who broke. "You will ruin her," he said. "She wanted out. She told me. She could not bear—" Guy's head lifted. "She told you?" "We meant to delay," Colling said. "A day, a letter, an explanation." "And the bundle?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Clothes," Colling said. "A plain dress, veil aside. No one would know." "Who helped her over the wall?" Miss Marple said. Mrs. Broom raised her head, drained. "I," she said. "Better than a scene at the church. I thought to protect the house. And her." "In protecting appearance," Miss Marple said, "you expose truth." She folded her hands. "At 10 tomorrow we shall fetch Miss Celia from where she was taken. Those who carried her there will come with us and say everything plainly." Outside, St. Jude struck the quarter. No one moved. The lilies on the sill let fall a dusting of gold. The next morning, the square filled with villagers under a pale sun that seemed reluctant to warm the air. Sergeant Cotter had arranged for the lorry driver to return, and the man stood sheepishly beside his vehicle, cap in hand, while Mrs. Withers and Mrs. Parry craned from behind the pump to catch every word. Guy Ellerton was there too, looking drawn but determined, and beside him Mr. Colling, whose confidence had drained since the tea at the vicarage. Mrs. Harbord arrived with her housekeeper in tow, her lips pressed tightly as though to forbid emotion. Miss Marple came last, as if she were merely curious about the gathering, her small figure inconspicuous amongst the crowd. The driver repeated his account. A woman in grey had flagged him near Mill Lane, passing up a small bundle to tuck under the canvas. He remembered her perfume more than her face, something cloying and sweet, and how she had borrowed a handkerchief, returning it hurriedly. Miss Marple, smiling kindly, asked him to look among the group. His eyes moved from Mrs. Harbord to Mrs. Broom, then to the cousin from Exeter. At the sight of the cousin, he hesitated, nodding slowly. "The scent," he said. "It was like that." The cousin flushed crimson, protesting that she had only been in the village a day and knew nothing of lorries. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "No, my dear, you are quite right. You were not the one in grey. You only lent your perfume. Perfume lingers, you see, and when a ribbon or a veil carries too much of it, one may trace it back to its bottle. But you did not tie the bouquet with a new ribbon, nor smear rouge on a bicycle bell. Those are not a girl's mistakes. They are the careful efforts of a housekeeper determined to preserve appearances." All eyes turned to Mrs. Broom, whose hands trembled now, twisting the apron she had folded so neatly. "I wanted only to spare her," she said, in a low voice. "She begged me, said she could not go through with it. I helped her over the wall, gave her a plain dress to change into. Mr. Colling said he would see her safe. Better than shame in the church, better than—" She faltered. Miss Marple inclined her head. "You meant kindness, but kindness tangled with pride. The truth would have been less cruel than this deception. For Celia is not dead, nor fled in scandal. She was hidden in a cottage by the old quarry, waiting for the storm to blow over, believing it was the only way to save her mother's dignity." Mr. Colling, however, did not intend merely to delay the wedding. He hoped to prevent it altogether. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Guy's eyes fixed on his friend, his voice hoarse. Is that true? Colin tried for composure, but the colour drained from him. She deserved better than a marriage she didn't want. She told me so herself. I thought, if she had time to see clearly, if she were away from all this, perhaps she would choose you instead, Miss Marple finished quietly. But love that begins with concealment rarely thrives. You arranged her absence too carefully, Mr. Colling. The bouquet altered, the ribbon discarded, the veil caught in the hedge, all signs to make us believe in a nervous bride. And yet Celia was not nervous. She was frightened, persuaded into hiding. That was your doing. Mrs. Harbord gave a strangled cry, covering her face. Guy stood very still, his expression unreadable. The cousin wept noisily. Mrs. Broom's shoulders sagged, as though years had suddenly pressed upon her. Miss Marple's tone remained calm. Sergeant Cotter will fetch Miss Celia now. She is tired, confused, but unharmed. It will be for her family to decide what future she chooses. But there is no mystery left, not of lorries, nor of accidents, nor of elopements, only of human weakness, misguided loyalty, ambition dressed as love, and fear of scandal greater than fear of truth. The crowd slowly dispersed, subdued, robbed of the darker tale they had half desired. Guy walked away without a word, his face pale with the weight of betrayal and relief. Mrs. Harbord clutched at Miss Marple's hand, whispering thanks that carried more pride than gratitude. Mrs. Broom allowed Cotter to lead her away, her defiance gone. Later, in the quiet of the vicarage garden, Miss Marple sat among the roses, her knitting on her lap. Ruby brought her tea, eyes shining. You always knew, didn't you, miss? Miss Marple smiled, her gaze far off. One never knows, my dear. One only observes. A ribbon too neatly hidden, a perfume too strong, a word too smooth. People show themselves when they try hardest to conceal. It is the way of human nature. She sipped her tea, serene. And human nature, I find, is far more reliable than any amount of evidence. The bells of St. Jude's told the hour, and the village of Little Ambrose settled once more into its daily rhythm. Yet beneath its calm surface lingered a reminder that joy and tragedy alike often spring from the same quiet motives, and that only a sharp eye, softened by kindness, could tell the difference. Miss Marple's eye, always watching, had once again ensured that the truth was not buried under appearances.